Hey everybody, it's Laura Caruso, and I have some thoughts I wanted to share with you this May 19th, 2020. And my first thought is I'm hopeful, and I hope that you are too. In the midst of all of the crazy circumstances in which we find ourselves today, our God is a God of hope, and I'm grateful that that is how I am feeling in these moments looking around me today. 2 months ago, all eyes were on the White House as information flooded in and we looked for direction in how to deal with a deadly new virus. Faulty models and deceptive reporting from governments, from the World Health Organization, and from much of the media were combined with dependence on a small group of scientists within the federal health establishment, rather than a diverse group of competing medical views. And all of that led us to believe that COVID-19 was equivalent to the plague. Clearly, it is not. Real infection and mortality rates are revealing that it's probable that 99.9% of people who are infected survive, the vast majority with mild, highly manageable symptoms. There are also now several promising therapeutics that further reduce the threat. The much greater threat was to liberty. Something felt very wrong because it was. 2 months ago, officials within the executive branch, with only a few very notable exceptions, sprang into action and launched emergency powers in order to deal with what they feared was an unprecedented threat. What was truly unprecedented were the measures required of us, the American people. When considered in full, they are breathtaking. Restrictions on movement, association, freedom of worship, peaceful assembly, and petitioning of our government. The haphazard sorting of workers and businesses into essential and non-essential, and the subsequent property rights violations. The infringement of personal liberty and privacy rights as snitch lines expanded state surveillance powers. And Florida's Department of Health, citing Florida Statute 381.00315, announced that, and I quote, "Pursuant to Executive Order 20-80 and the Florida Department of Health Declaration of a Public Health Emergency, the state health officer and Surgeon General can order any individual to be examined, tested, vaccinated, treated, isolated, or quarantined for COVID-19. This is stunning. And of course, all of these unconstitutional policies advanced because another fundamental right called due process was suspended due to the state of emergency. What was also breathtaking and continues to be was the lack of check and balance actions from legislatures, from the judiciary, and from our local governing officials. As Charles Kessler of the Claremont Institute recently wrote, the decrees of mayors, governors, and public health officers are being treated as laws, though no legislatures have enacted them, nor courts reviewed them. John Calvin, yes, that John Calvin, would call this nefarious perfidy. Now hang with me. I think we all kind of know somewhere back in our minds that our representatives are there to serve and protect us, but we've forgotten that the big reason they're there is to serve as a check against abuse by another branch of government or a higher level of civil government, to rein them in, to bring them back to the standard of the law, that overarching law to which all are accountable, even the king. Okay? This is what Magna Carta was about. This was what Reformation-era philosophers wrote about as they resisted tyrannical leaders who sought both their lives and their consciences. This was what the English Petition of Right in 1628 and the ensuing English Civil War against Charles I was about. And English colonists in America by that time looked back across the Atlantic and they watched and they learned as Parliament resisted and prevailed against that tyrant king. This was what the American War for Independence was about. And this is why your constitutional republic was designed as it was, the rule of law. I have a little image that I've put into the blog that's on my website, and it's an image of Samuel Adams. It's a very famous oil painting done by John Singleton Copley, and it portrays the morning after the Boston Massacre. We see Samuel Adams, face of a lion, and it's as he appeared looking across the desk at the royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson. And Adams is pointing to the law. He's reminding the governor that the citizens of Boston are protected by the law. They have the rights of Englishmen, and that he must acknowledge those. Now, I mentioned John Calvin. Many of you may not know that the reformer John Calvin included sections on the biblical principles of civil government in his famous Institutes. So I hope you'll bear with me for a second here. I want you to be convinced in your minds about this idea, so I want to teach you for just a moment. Calvin wrote in Volume 4, Chapter 20 of the Institutes, I quote, "It very rarely happens that kings regulate themselves so that their will is never at variance with justice and rectitude." That very rarely happens, that we get a king, right, who just is right in line with all that is right and good. It very rarely happens because power corrupts. All right, let me get back to Calvin. He says, "The vice or imperfection of men therefore renders it safer and more tolerable for the government to be in the hands of the many, so that if any one arrogate to himself more than is right, the many may act as censors and masters to restrain his ambition." Calvin's basically saying power corrupts. So it's better if power is distributed to the many, who can restrain a leader who's gone off the rails. He goes on to say, this has always been proved by experience, and the Lord confirmed it by his authority when he established a government of this kind among the people of Israel. Did you catch that? God himself, recognizing, of course, the sin nature of man, the tendency for centralization of power and corruption, established a decentralized system of representative government in the 12 tribes of the Exodus, and in fact, warned the children of Israel extensively about establishing a monarchy and the dangers that would come with that. But there's more. Calvin went on to describe the duties of those many, those lower magistrates that held the power of government. Calvin's words, "If there are now any magistrates of the people appointed to restrain the willfulness of kings, in accordance with their duty, if they wink at kings who violently fall upon and assault the lowly common folk, I declare that their dissimulation," fancy word for deceit, their deceit, "involves nefarious perfidy." Nefarious perfidy is wicked and deliberate breach of trust. Strong words from Calvin about magistrates who do not protect the people. He says they are guilty of dissimulation involving nefarious perfidy because they dishonestly betray the freedom of the people, of which they know they have been appointed protectors by God's ordinance. So I know nobody says it quite like Calvin, but it boils down to this. When higher civil authority makes an unjust, immoral, outside the law decree, the lower ranking civil authority has both the right and the duty to protect the people by refusing to enforce it, and they may, if necessary, actively resist the superior authority. And if they don't, they've deceitfully betrayed the people that they have pledged to protect and serve. Hence, Calvin's nefarious perfidy, right? Many other philosophers will come behind Calvin, expanding on his thoughts, very notably Samuel Rutherford, another pastor, also a diplomat, writing in the mid-1600s, right in the middle of that English Civil War. He wrote Lex Rex, the law is king, explaining from Scripture why it was vital to resist tyranny in the civil sphere, but how to do that biblically. Meaning, yes, even in light of Romans 13. One of the key elements here is that the officials are not the authority that must always be obeyed. The law is the authority, and everybody's subject to it, including the king. Lex Rex, the law is king. In a constitutional republic such as ours, it is we the people, through our representatives, we must hold those that are in governing authority accountable to the law. Now, another very key point by Rutherford, like Calvin, was that resistance has to come through proper channels, our local representatives. It's not pitchforks and torches in the streets. It's through your lower magistrates who've been given the duty of protecting the people. We should all be familiar with Rutherford. Our founders certainly were. So, while I've sent my share of emails and tweets to Governor DeSantis, I've spent more time contacting my local officials, my lower magistrates. And the good news is that they responded. personally, kindly. The bad news, across the board, the responses were basically, we can't do anything because of the governor's executive order. I persisted, and so should you. We have to urge these local representatives to represent our objections up the chain and stand up against unjustified infringements of constitutional liberties. We're in a scary place when our local officials just see themselves as branch offices of the state government. Why are we in that place? Well, because so few understand the fundamentals of how our constitutional republic was designed and the foundations upon which it was built. And because of that, few really have the courage of their convictions. We can be thankful that after 2 months of this nonsense, there are finally a few sheriffs, mayors, legislators across the country who are saying that they will not enforce unjust and unlawful edicts. And there are courts beginning to overturn those things. In Florida, Ocala Mayor Kent Wynn has said that their police department will not enforce limitations on businesses or other guidelines mandated by the governor. State Representative Anthony Sabatini of Lake County has emerged as a leader in articulating why the ways in which this emergency power is being used in Florida are unconstitutional, and he's filed several lawsuits to fight them. So I started this essay by saying I'm hopeful. And that I hoped you were too. That's because I believe that for many, what we're in right now is a wake-up call. In fact, I'm seeing many more people voicing concerns about federalism and local self-government and constitutional rights, even if they're not using that language. Sometimes you don't appreciate what you have until it's yanked away, and we're still in the midst of a pretty alarming preview. But I think many are seeing that we've allowed God's gifts of life, liberty, and property, uniquely planted and protected for centuries in America, to slip to the edge of a precipice. So, if you're one of those folks and you're wondering what to do next, my answer is that of Saint Benedict. Ora et labora. Pray and work. There are many fronts where life, liberty, and property are under attack, and you can't fight on every front. Believe me, I'm preaching to myself right here. We must first really seek God about where to invest our time and how to best serve him, and then be willing to go where he calls. As Martin Luther famously said, work from early until late. In fact, I have so much to do, I shall spend the first 3 hours in prayer. Seek God first, be willing to go where he calls. With that said, here are some of the things that have been stirring in me particularly. Some thoughts from me about front lines where immediate action is needed to pull us back from the edge. Number 1, intentionally love your neighbor and give grace. Guys, people have been scared to death by the media coverage of coronavirus and the messaging that's out there. So be kind to others, whatever their mask preference is. It's an incredible blessing for those of us that are free from fear, but we need to be winsome and not preachy as we embrace the ability to go to dinner, to worship with others, or to return to an office. Intentionally help others remember that normal is wonderful, not scary. Perhaps invite them to sit in your driveway at a distance and hang out in the evening, or go for a bike ride together to a local spot and just sit outside and have an iced tea. You know your neighbors, you know what to do. Reject the language, number 2. There is absolutely no justification for any kind of new normal. New normal is a code for increased civil government interference, surveillance, regulations, and rules. Stop saying it. Same thing for social distancing and stay safe. Now, it's not that you don't want people to be safe, but when you continually focus their attention on staying safe, it implies that there's imminent danger all around. So just, how about so good to see you, have a great night? Words matter, but that's a whole other essay. Number 3, learn about liberty. What this has done is expose our ignorance. Most of us weren't taught the foundations of our freedom, and neither were our children. I'm passionately committed, those of you that know me know this, I am passionately committed to preparing the next generation and their parents to understand why life, liberty, and property are not just good ideas, they are God ideas, and they're worth defending. Guys, this isn't wrapping the Bible in the flag. God really does communicate truths about every area of life in his word. Remember, there are 4 legitimate God-ordained spheres of government with limited roles and limited jurisdictions, and they're not to step on one another. There are biblical standards that govern each of them: the family, the individual, the church, the civil spheres. In God's providence, in this country, we've been blessed with a civil government designed to protect the civil government, to protect the other spheres, but not to step on them. And we don't have a king. We have a constitutional republic. So part of our role in this government of the people is to hold elected officials accountable to the ultimate ruler, the law, not to mindlessly obey. I'm working on some additional short topical videos on specific timely issues like Rutherford's biblical resistance theory, that kind of thing. But if you need government history classes for your homeschooling high schooler, or you want to learn about liberty while you're standing in the places where it was born, you can learn more about what I do at providentialhistory.net. There are other sources as well. There are other folks that do a great job of teaching these foundational ideas. Seek that out. The rest of these are political action points. So things that you can communicate to your lower magistrates. Don't feel like you have to do them all, but do something. I'm contacting Governor DeSantis, Lieutenant Governor Nunes, my state representative and senator, my county commissioners, my CDD board, but basically with the same message. There's a lot of cutting and pasting. So it saves you time if you can kind of put together the message you want to send and keeping it brief, and then send that message, a firm but kind and polite message, to all of these folks. Number 4, then, is ask for full opening of our state now. Freedom is not phased in, so no more phased in freedom. The executive branch seized property rights and civil liberties of Floridians on an emergency basis. The justification given was to flatten the curve, and that's been met. And as such, all of those executive order limitations on businesses and schools and local municipalities should be lifted. And decisions about how and when to open need to be shifted to the local level to those entities. Guys, the power needs to be back in the hands of the many, where targeted decision-making can be made and officials are more directly accountable then to their constituents. Self-government is the cornerstone of this society. We demand the right to exercise self-government once again. In the written blog piece, I have inserted an editorial that was co-written by Florida State Representative Anthony Sabatini, and his words may be helpful to you if you're trying to articulate some of those things. Number 5, join the Reopen Florida Facebook group. It's Reopen FL on Facebook. And if nothing else, guys, you're another number you add to their clout because people are watching. So you'll find some interesting articles there, but it helps to have those numbers in that Reopen FL Facebook group. Number 6, say no to track and trace expansions. There's incredible danger to personal liberty and privacy with the massive new funding and new programs for tracking and tracing of COVID-19 infection. Do any of us doubt that if this power is gained, it will be abused? Now, I know that there's been limited track and trace protocols within the Department of Health for years, that track and trace itself is not a new idea. But if the level that we had prior to this point was sufficient for H1N1 and it was sufficient for flu, it should be sufficient for the non-plague that is coronavirus. But what we're now hearing proposed is an immense expansion. We've been told that they're scaling up an army of contact tracers to be, quote, sure that you get contacted in case you come in contact with someone who has tested positive for COVID-19. Okay, the only way that happens, you get contacted, coming in contact with someone, the only way that happens is for government to be aware of your location at all times, such that interactions with known cases could be tracked. This is an incredible invasion of privacy and violation of the Fourth Amendment. Let your federal legislative delegation know that you oppose the federal bill, H.R. 6666, and let your local representatives know that you oppose any expansion of track and trace measures at the state level. Again, in the written blog, I've put some links in that might be helpful to you in that regard. Number 7, say no to a mandatory coronavirus vaccine. Now, I know, before we freak out, the word mandatory hasn't actually been floated by any official source, but the discussion is certainly present in mainstream medical discussions. Incredible amounts of money are being deployed, the National Guard mobilized, and the White House is talking about a goal of 300 million doses, which is just about the population of the United States. So guys, if it's produced and it's paid for, and the military is deployed to distribute it, it seems like there may be some pretty significant incentives to take it. And again, the impact of coronavirus does not justify this massive infringement on personal liberty. So we should be preemptively communicating that mandatory vaccination for COVID-19 will not be tolerated, nor would privacy-busting immunization certificates that might force people to receive a questionable and unneeded vaccine in order to exercise basic rights. I'd start messaging on that now. Number 8, defend the integrity of your vote. COVID-19 is being used to justify major changes in election procedures, like crazy changes that almost guarantee massive fraudulent voting and the dilution of legal votes. Folks, we are in a huge struggle for control of the political direction of Florida as well as the country, and elections are a major front. Mail-in ballots may seem benign until you dig in a bit. What's actually being proposed in the $3 trillion H.R. 6800, that's the HEROES Act you're hearing about, but also in state actions. What's being proposed are ballots mailed to every registered voter, not just active voters, mailed whether they're requested or not, with no ID enforcement allowed. Voter rolls are always grossly out of date, and thousands of ballots will be mailed to people who have died, who have moved, etc. So now those ballots are just floating around out there. In addition, H.R. 6800, the federal bill, encourages mail to everybody, but also have in-person voting. You talk about chaos. It weakens current rules that invalidate ballots because of mismatched signature. And H.R. 6800 weakens any rules that would prohibit vote harvesting. It's literally an invitation to absolute election chaos and fraud, and it must be stopped. There are already accommodations in place in every state for registered voters desiring an absentee ballot if they should prefer to vote that way. Mandating all mail-in voting violates citizens' rights to vote in federal elections in the manner that was chosen by their state legislature. Many folks don't understand that part of the constitutional restrictions on the federal government are that states control the manner of their own elections. So mandating this would immediately go to court. But again, it would cause a lot of chaos in the process in these months that are leading up to the presidential election. You can read more about H.R. 6800 proposals in a link that I've placed in the on the blog itself. And I would encourage you to at least check out, possibly join and support a group called True the Vote, who has dedicated themselves to ensuring election integrity. I said earlier that words matter, like stay safe and new normal. Well, Charles Kessler of the Claremont Institute, who I quoted earlier, also recently wrote this. He said, one word that's been in no danger of turning into a cliche is liberty. So far in this crisis, American liberty may be the only thing about which there has not been an abundance of caution. But I have hope. Let's you and I focus on liberty together.